The maximum climate goal that the United Nations Climate Forum seeks in terms of preventing man-made global warming for all times to come is already happening. It is here. Open your eyes. End the dreaming. What science seeks in its dreaming, a world without man-made global warming, is already demonstrably real. The fears of an overheated world are fears in dreams where nothing is actually real. The human world is a world of living, building, creating. It is a world of beauty, art, science, music, and caring, where the most amazing is totally real, and the power of the human being is demonstrated in the small and in the large, like the grand fire that lit up the Eiffel Tower at the 1889 World Exposition in Paris, France. The world was waking up in those days to the great human potential that still remains a light for all times. But we are told that this optimism is archaic, as many now believe in their dreams and nightmares. We are told by the elite of the world that the earth is fast overheating by the consequences of human living on the earth. Each breath we take leaves in its wake a cloud of carbon molecules called CO2, classified a dangerous pollutant, termed a greenhouse gas. It is addressed with fear for its rapidly increasing. We are told that with each house we build, each car we drive, each factories we operate, we add to the pollution that drives up the global warming, climate change. We are told that the pollution we emit has been skyrocketing since the dawn of industrialization. We are told that this mistaken history must be reversed. Carbon energy production must stop. The human presence must be called back to less than 1 billion people. For this demand, industries are being destroyed, and the food that humanity needs to live is being burned in gigantic quantities. Is this a dream, or is it real? Let me show you what you will see when you awake and stop dreaming. That's the challenge. You will see a world that is quite different than in dreams. In awaking to reality, you discover that no form of human action, no matter how big, has the power to cause climate change on Earth. You discover that every climate change in history, even the worst of them, originates with the sun. You discover that minute forms of weakening on the sun have large effects on the cosmic ray flux streaming from the sun. You will discover that the invisible changes in solar cosmic ray flux cause large changes in cloudiness on Earth, which changes the amount of the radiated energy from the sun that is reflected back into space and thereby becomes lost to us. You will discover that historic solar cosmic ray flux can be precisely measured in carbon-14 ratios, and that the measured high flux periods correspond with cold times, and low flux periods with warm times. You will discover that CO2 greenhouse actions are too minuscule, to cause any measurable climate effects. You will discover that the measured large increase in CO2 since the dawn of industrialization is not man-made. You will discover that the global CO2 recycling conveyor system gives us back today by its long transit time the high volume of CO2 that had been dissolved into the oceans during the Little Ice Age and before. You will discover that you have no reason to fear any man-made climate changes, but that you would wish instead that we had this capability as a means to avoid the next ice age in 30 years. That's the only climate factor with an existential challenge attached. The reason why the world is in a coma today and is largely unaware of the reality that actual science unfolds, ironically appears to be rooted in a scientific discovery itself, and this takes us back in time to the Roman era. Early in the Roman era, the Roman politician and military general Quintus Fabius Maximus has pioneered a principle for the protection of his country, which might be termed the principle of the strategic defense. Rome had been under attack by the vastly superior forces led by the Punic Carthaginian military commander Hannibal Barca, who is considered one of the greatest military commanders in history. Hannibal had occupied much of Italy for 15 years, but had never actually achieved a complete victory. Fabius Maximus had developed a strategy of irregular warfare that had enabled the small Roman forces to prevent the superior opponent from defeating the state. His strategic defense was not to attack Hannibal, but to grind the opposing forces into the dust by denying them the means to operate. He attacked Hannibal's logistics. Quintus Fabius became famous for this. He was honored for this strategy of irregular warfare that saved Rome, not by direct confrontation, but by grinding the superior opponent down and down into the dust, for which he earned the title, the Shield of Rome. The pioneered strategy of Quintus Fabius Maximus was not forgotten. It was modernized. It was transformed from a platform for the strategic defense of a nation into a comprehensive informal system of modern irregular warfare that operates in ambush to maintain an empire against the scientific and moral power of an advancing humanity. The principle of modern irregular warfare appears to have been chosen by the masters of the oligarchic system of empire for the defense of their system that lacks itself a foundation to exist, but hangs on to its power against the vastly superior force of human progress that stands as a threat to the system of empire. The masters feared the power of a humanist cultural renaissance, an advancing scientific, technological, and industrial development that creates a high-level progressive world in which the system of empire would have no place to exist. It would be surprising, in the context of the critical strategic situation that the masters of empire find themselves in evermore, if the grind-down method of General Quintus Fabius Maximus would not be applied again as an emergency platform to maintain the decaying system of oligarchic control against the vastly superior potential of an advancing humanity. The end result of this process became the principle of modern irregular warfare, as it is now called. It would also be surprising if the now ongoing war against humanity and human progress would not include a component of war that is directed against science and truth, which are the very foundation of advancing civilization. It would be further surprising if the man-made carbon climate change project, which has not a single item of scientific evidence standing in support of it, would not have been created as a card in the deck of modern irregular warfare to maintain the system of empire that has no basis to exist in a progressive human world, but still continues to wield its historic influence and political and financial control. The evidence is sometimes surprising. While it is possible that the worst of human action in the form of a global thermonuclear war would cause a prolonged nuclear winter by injecting vast amounts of material into the atmosphere and even the stratosphere, which would wipe out food production around the world and starve the survivors to death. The giant climate upset would nevertheless remain to be but a temporary thing, perhaps for a few decades in duration, which of course only a few people might survive, if any. But this isn't what the climate hoopla is about. The man-made climate change trap has no basis. The dreaming is focused on minute changes in the atmosphere, extended over long periods that are deemed accumulative and increasing, which are said to have raised the density of carbon gases in the air that are said to threaten the world with runaway global warming, to melt the ice caps and flood large areas of low-elevation land. This tragic long-term prediction is false, though it has been erroneously accepted for a long time and has caused increasingly enormous consequences in human living on an unimaginable scale, while no measurable global warming has actually occurred. Does this ring like a paradox? Let's try to solve the paradox by searching out what is actually real. When we look at historic climate records in ice samples from Greenland, going back in time through the entire period where what we call civilization has developed, we recognize that some extremely long climate changes have occurred on our planet, but those, according to all evidence, have been the result of cosmic action, not human action. The human presence was minuscule for most of the long span of human history, almost to the present time. So what did cause these very large and sometimes rapid climate changes that we have records of in ice core samples, as shown here for the last 10,000 years? There is only one cause possible, namely that the numerous large climate fluctuations that we have evidence of are expressions of cosmic fluctuations. Is this true? Do we have evidence for the assumptions? Or is the global warming hoopla true? Is it supported by evidence that supports its assumptions? The fact is, the global warming hoopla has no evidence for its claim. The Earth has been in a cooling trend since 1998, even while the CO2 levels are rising. So let's look at the cosmic scene as a cause for the climate changes. What evidence do we find there? Well, when we look for cosmic factors, the sun, which creates our climate in the first place, is the prime cosmic factor for all the climate changes on Earth that have occurred. The sun does produce cosmic reflux. We can measure it. We have measured it with satellites, and we have measured it changing. We also know that changes in solar cosmic reflux have a big impact on the climate on Earth by their effect on cloudiness. The solar cosmic ray fluctuations, in turn, are themselves demonstrably caused by cosmic factors outside of the solar system that affect our sun in ways that allow coronal holes to occur. This cosmic linkage has always existed. This is the truth. Some of the cosmic actions on our climate have been enormous, as you can see. They have caused 3 great warm periods in the last 4,000 years. Some are so distant and large that they are no longer imaginable in the present for the lack of comparable experiences. The most dramatic period of global warming in recent times, which has been experienced in part, has occurred at the end of the Little Ice Age from the 1850s on. This warming period, in recovering from the Little Ice Age, coincides roughly with the time of the start of the Industrial Revolution. The massive glacial deposits left over from the 300 years long Little Ice Age began to melt during what became referred to in modern time as the Great Global Warming Period. From the end of the Little Ice Age to the present, carbon-based energy production gave the world's atmospheric CO2 component a boost. In this time frame, the atmospheric CO2 level increased from 270 parts per million, which some dispute, to 390 parts per million, which is the currently measured average. Let's assume that a 44 increase really did happen, which is likely. Is it reasonable, then, to assume that the experienced rewarming of the Earth after the Little Ice Age has resulted from the increase in atmospheric CO2, and that the increase of it was man-made, simply because it occurred during the Industrial Revolution. The entire global warming hoopla is based on that. Or was the rewarming of the Earth a natural consequence of cosmic factors that had nothing to do with human activity and CO2 climate forcing, so that both factors simply became abused in retrospect for a scare campaign for political objectives without anything real standing behind them? How much truth is in that? In what direction does the evidence point? One of the activists of the political climate campaign has answered the question in this way, saying, "We have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts we may have. Each of us has to decide himself what is the right balance between being effective and being honest." That this direction became the general trend came to light years later, near the time of the 2009 UN Climate Conference in Copenhagen, where a mass of leaked emails from a leading climate institution had revealed that the much heralded climate data that the scare campaign was based on had been simply made up. While this is all interesting, it really doesn't prove anything, does it? Where then can we find real proof that we can trust? Can we find evidence that is physically measurable? The increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere is measurable. It has been measured. It is real. Does this also mean that the horrific climate scare scenarios that are based on the CO2 increase that have been promoted for the last 40 years are also real? The scare scenarios are promoted by the UN and other world organizations, and they continue to be so promoted to the present. The promotion is based on the physical fact that the carbon dioxide gas, called CO2 by its chemical formula, has the capacity to absorb energy in a process similar to light absorption, and is able to radiate the absorbed energy back into the atmosphere in a scattered fashion. That's all true. CO2 does have the capability to absorb light energy and emit it back, but is everything of it true? On the surface, it seems that man-made global warming is true. The CO2 has increased. The energy-absorbing quality of the CO2 gas has been measured. It has been rightfully termed a greenhouse gas. Its energy absorption quality has also been measured. It has been measured, and it has been plotted in terms of its absorption coefficient. The coefficient has been measured across the entire light spectrum and beyond. And here it gets interesting. Water vapor dominates the stage. CO2 affects nothing comparatively because of its 10 times lower absorption coefficient and its 100 times lower density in the air, and its 20 times smaller coverage of the spectrum. In addition to all that, its effectiveness is limited to the low energy end of the spectrum. The proof is in the fact that while global CO2 levels are rising, the Earth is actually getting colder. The Institute of Solar Terrestrial Physics in Irkutsk has measured a whopping 1.9 degree drop in average annual on-the-ground measured temperatures. These facts are being ignored in the scare hoopla theaters. Colder temperatures have been experienced all over the world, while the CO2 levels keep going up. The key for solving this paradox is located in the effect of water vapor. The dramatic difference between the absorption coefficient for CO2 and for water vapor is the result of the CO2's strong molecular bond in comparison with the extremely weak bond for the water molecule that responds more readily on a much wider range of light energy. It would be amazing if the CO2 molecule, with this built-in deficiency, would have a significant effect on our climate, especially when one considers that water vapor, that is 10 times more efficient, is typically 100 times more densely present. In addition to all that, the giant factor that water vapor is, has its density directly affected by cosmic factors that affect the cloud-forming process. The cloud-forming process draws on the water vapor in the air, which reduces the prevailing water vapor density in the atmosphere. With all this considered, the water vapor factor, which is directly affected by solar cosmic ray flux density fluctuations, adds up to being a significant factor in affecting the climate on Earth. The CO2 factor in comparison is so small that it is actually not physically measurable in the real world. It should be seen as a paradox, what we behold in the real world. We are injecting large volumes of CO2 into the atmosphere. According to the carbon climate change models, the Earth should be roasting. Instead, it is getting colder. Nor does this paradox deter the global warming song. The global warming song continues, in spite of the evidence, which adds another paradox. Lord Russell explained the paradox. As the intellectual master of the system of empire, he understood Quintus Fabius Maximus and his principle of grinding the opponent into dust by denying the opponent the logistics that are essential for a human society or a human military force to function. The principle was understood by the German poet Friedrich Schiller, who had aimed to inspire society to rebuild itself from within in order to free itself from the scourge of empire that had dominated Europe at the time. The idea resonated in Russia and inspired the defense of Russia against the immensely greater force of Napoleon in the War of 1812 on the principle of grinding Napoleon's force into dust by defeating its logistics. Lord Russell understood that the modern logistical base of humanity is its science and scientific and technological progress. In his book, The Impact of Science on Society, he makes it rather plain that for empire to defend itself against humanity, which he defined as the enemy, Humanity's modern logistical base, which is its science as the keystone in human culture, must be defeated. For this, he champions the mass elimination of humanity. He says in the book that wars are insufficient to have this effect. He says that the depopulation must be accomplished through the back door, by waging war on science and truth. The point is that there is no point in trying to understand the carbon-climate issue as an issue outside the context of the modern irregular warfare. The prime objective of empire is to defend its existence. Lord Russell made it clear that humanity is the declared enemy and that science and truth is its power. This means that the carbon-climate fraud, which makes sense only in the context of empire aiming to defend itself against humanity, is not about to be called off. Modern irregular warfare is a part of this strategic landscape. It is here to stay for as long as possible. When it falls, empire falls. The concept of modern irregular warfare is rather simple when it is seen in the context of the oligarchic system aiming to achieve world domination without the use of world wars that in the nuclear age are no longer possible. This means that the goal of world domination must be pursued below the threshold of world wars by means of subversive warfare from within. During the big world wars, the goal has been to destroy the populations, their infrastructures, and their industries. This goal is now pursued subversively. The process is inexpensive, and it is vastly more destructive than open warfare had been. It has become recognized that it is more destructive and devastating on society for it to become subjected to numerous false idealisms that render the human being as immoral, despicable, greedy, irresponsible, and worthless scum, even a danger to itself, to its resources, to its environment, and to its very existence. That the population card that empire plays fits into this stack of objectives, as does the terrorizing environmental card and the carbon climate card. Each one of these cards is subversively destructive on society by design. Each card is expertly played. Against this background, the carbon scare card is not surprising. When Bertrand Russell of the British Empire argued for the mass killing of society with vectored diseases for the purpose of depopulation, he evidently didn't have the actual mass murdering of society in mind. It makes no sense for the masters to kill the slaves that supply their living. The textbook objective in modern irregular warfare is far more devastating on society than the physical murdering would be. The objective is to kill the soul and to degrade the status of men so deeply that society becomes ashamed of itself for being alive. The endlessly repeated depopulation song has this effect. The carbon climate change song has the same effect. They are cards of a larger deck of cards. They are in the deck side by side with the card of naked terrorism and the ultimate terror card of thermonuclear war. These cards are all expertly played. The carbon climate change ideology is a devastating card that is not based on anything real. It is a card that puts the devastating problem before society, for which no solution is possible in the framework in which it is presented, other than for society to commit economic suicide or to depopulate itself, since society itself is said to be the cause of the problem. A project of this type has a devastating effect on the human mind. The mind is trapped thereby into a self-perception for which no acceptable solution is deemed possible. In such a case, the mind reverts backwards to a more infantile state of thinking. This appears to be intentional. At the more infantile state, society is more easily controlled. The term global warming has in this context been employed as a terror phrase that is effective, even if there is no truth behind it. Society has become inspired by its terror song deep in its soul to be ashamed to be alive as a burden to the earth. The effect may be the reason why the global warming doctrine is so intensively guarded against the truth. To even think the truth is slandered as an act of global warming denial. It is deemed a crime thereby to be honest with oneself. Typically, the depopulation card and the global warming card are played together to maximize their effect. Placed into skillful hands, these cards are being played from behind the smoke screens, so that the objectives are rarely ever recognized. While in the case of the 2009 climate conference in Copenhagen, the climate fraud became proudly exposed by the aristocrat Lord Monckton, who cited that key climate facts were simply made up in high-level institutions, as had been revealed by leaked emails. He failed to expose the purpose for the fraud. He failed to see what stands behind this type of scene, behind the official face. He failed to see the connection of the fraud as an attack on humanity. He didn't mention the depopulation target, which at this time had been openly set at 2.3 billion people as the allowable optimum world population. The figure has since been reduced to less than 1 billion people as the allowable optimum world population. The deployment of the global warming card in conjunction with the depopulation card signifies that the common climate scare fraud is promoted as an element of the modern irregular warfare objective that the masters of empire had been playing already from the late 1700s on, though ever more vigorously so, as a means for protecting the essentially feudal platform that all systems of empire depend on. It may be interesting to note here that the 40-year global warming irregular warfare campaign was started up in 1974 out of the blue and was organized from the halls of empire in synchronism with other imperial objectives of a similar nature. The tragic fact is that the irregular warfare projects are all succeeding. Today, after 40 years of psychological war, much of the world sings the carbon scarecrow song from the heart, rigorously and proudly, indicating that everyone is essentially asleep and dreaming of a world that has nothing to do with reality, but which is terribly scary. The dreamers will even fight you if you urge them to awake. The dreamers have regressed to finding comfort in illusions, and they comply with them as if the illusions were real. At this low-level state of dreaming, reality no longer matters. For example, it is a fact that the great global warming of the Earth, when the deep freeze of the Little Ice Age ended, is not recognized as a cosmic phenomenon that is plain to see, even while it is massively supported as a cosmic phenomenon by real physical evidence. In the sleeping world, where real evidence isn't a factor, the rewarming of the Earth is attributed entirely to human industrial action and its corresponding energy-rich living, which both produce atmospheric carbon gases, while it is hidden from the sleeping world that the life-critical carbon gases that have become emitted are known to have essentially no effect on the Earth's climate whatsoever. The cultivated blindness to reality leaves one to wonder how deep the climate dreaming has actually become. The obvious answer is that what we see happening in the world is only possible when society is successfully inspired to close its eyes to the obvious facts around it, to commit itself to slumber and to ruminating over scare stories in a drama of nightmares about runaway global warming that overheats the Earth, melts all glaciers, floods the Earth with ice turned into water, that raises the sea level, which nothing can stop than society committing suicide. That's scary indeed. Shouldn't society rather open its eyes? When it would, a different world would come into view than the one that it beholds in dreaming. But this awakening isn't happening, is it? It is prevented by the constantly ongoing psychological warfare that plays on what is not real. The emerging scene that the awakening society would see would be the world of reality, linked with honesty and science. It would become plainly apparent then that the massive global warming that has occurred in the period past the Little Ice Age had absolutely a cosmic cause linked to it, with the sun standing behind it, rather than the Earth being supersensitive to the magical CO2 that is measured in parts per million and is vastly overshadowed by the greenhouse effect of water vapor that makes up 97% of the greenhouse effect, which itself isn't the driving climate factor anyway, but is secondary in nature. By viewing the world with open eyes and honest science, society would easily recognize that increased cloudiness reflects increased amounts of solar radiation back into space, which thereby becomes lost to the Earth and vice versa. This means that all the big climate changes in the world are effects of ever-changing cloudiness, which in turn is affected by cosmic actions that are affecting the sun, which is all physically measurable. The evidence for the cosmic origin for climate action is rather plain when one factors into the context the effect of cosmic rays on the cloud-forming process. All cosmic ray flux has an ionizing effect on the atmosphere. The electric ionizing effect enhances water vapor nucleation in the atmosphere that generates cloud droplets. It is measurable that most of the cosmic ray flux that impacts the Earth originates with the Sun in the form of solar cosmic ray flux. The solar cosmic ray flux is massive. It has been measured in the range of 1 to 1,000 events per square meter per second, and it is constantly changing with cosmic factors that affect our Sun. Galactic cosmic ray flux is rare in comparison, though more energetic. The Little Ice Age was demonstrably the direct result of larger volumes of solar cosmic ray flux reaching the Earth at the time, which was a solar weak time that is evident in the lack of sunspots. The cause for the solar weak time and the corresponding large solar cosmic ray flux is of course located far outside the solar system itself, where the sources are located that power our Sun, which also affect our Sun. The changes in solar cosmic ray flux can be dramatic. The flux increase typically results when voids develop in the solar corona. In these cases, the normally dense solar corona, which normally absorbs large amounts of cosmic rays that are generated on the surface of the Sun, develops regional voids. When the corona weakens by weaker solar activity, the voids allow larger volumes of cosmic ray flux to escape and reach the Earth. How dramatic the voids can become becomes apparent when the voids appear at the edge of the Sun. The coronal holes are thereby shown as huge gaps in the corona. During the Little Ice Age, the Earth was so cold that rivers froze up and became skating rinks. Agriculture failed so dramatically that 10% of the population starved to death in some countries, up to 30% in the northern countries. The Sun had been in a state of prolonged, extremely low solar activity at the time. The result was a 300-year period of little ice ages, from roughly 1550 to 1850. For a large portion in this period, no sunspots had been observed on the Sun at all, as if the Sun had gone to sleep, which in a sense it had. Sunspots typically occur only during high activity periods when the Sun is intensely powered. Sunspots are a type of electric overload condition that rips holes into the photosphere. During the solar weak periods, the solar activity becomes too weak for sunspots to erupt. That's when fewer or smaller or no sunspots occur. In weak periods, the Sun's corona is correspondingly weaker, so that holes develop more readily in the Sun's corona. The holes enable larger floods of solar cosmic rays to penetrate the solar shield, which then impact the Earth. As I said before, the increased cosmic ray flux hitting the Earth increases cloudiness by cosmic ray ionization of the atmospheric water vapor. This relationship has been verified with satellite measurements and laboratory experiments. When artificial cosmic rays were injected into a test chamber, the resulting water vapor nucleation went straight up and off the chart. As I said before, increased cloudiness reflects a larger portion of the solar radiated energy back into space, which thereby becomes lost to us. The white tops of the clouds are efficient reflectors of the radiated sunlight. When this happens for long periods and happens intensively, a little ice age results. That's what happened briefly in the 1300s and more so between the 1500s and the 1700s into the 1800s. The Sun was so weak in these times that just a few sunspots per year were visible in the 1600s when sunspots were counted and recorded. At the end of the 1600s, only 50 sunspots had been counted in 28 years, in comparison with the 50,000 that are recorded in recent times for such a period. The near total absence of sunspots stood clearly behind the coldest period in recent times, which became termed the Little Ice Age, that nobody wants to see happening again. The solar activity had been so low in this period that it had opened the door to high rates of solar cosmic ray flux impacting the Earth, with the effect of increased cloudiness and cold climates. It appears in retrospect that the Sun had barely recovered from this prolonged low activity period. In this context, it becomes imperative to explore what proof we have for a direct connection between the diminished sunspots and the colder climate on Earth. We know from historic observations that when the sunspots disappeared, the climate became cold, and when the sunspots were back in big numbers, the climate recovered. Do we have physically measurable evidence for this? Do we have hard evidence that the theorized link between the Sun and the climate on Earth actually exists, and that this link really is the elusive solar cosmic ray flux that no one can see? The answer is yes. The proof is provided by the carbon-14 isotope. What is carbon-14? Carbon-14 is an unnatural carbon atom that is created by solar cosmic ray flux acting on the Earth's atmosphere. The density of this unnatural isotope can be precisely measured. It therefore establishes a basis for measuring historic solar cosmic ray flux. The natural atomic structure of the carbon atom is made up of 6 protons and 6 neutrons in the core, which thereby renders it to be carbon-12. In the 1940s, the existence of a rare carbon-14 isotope had been discovered, which is heavier. The carbon-14 gets the designation 14 because it has 2 extra neutrons attached. C14 is rare, therefore, in the atmosphere, in the order of 2 parts per trillion, but it is measurable. The only known natural source for carbon-14 in the air is the interaction of solar cosmic ray flux with atoms in the atmosphere that by the collision emit free neutrons. The free neutrons subsequently collide with an atom of atmospheric nitrogen. In this secondary collision, one of the protons of the nitrogen atom is displaced by the colliding neutron. In the process, the nitrogen atom becomes transformed into a carbon-14 isotope. The carbon-14 isotope is widely used for carbon dating purposes because the unnatural precarious isotope decays with a half-life of 5,730 years. The rate of decay is used for dating organic objects. But this is not the only cause for which the isotope is valuable. The carbon-14 measurement is also used as a direct measurement for the solar cosmic ray flux, which creates the isotope in the first place. The result is amazing. When one plots the measured carbon-14 values that one finds in historic deposits going back thousands of years, an amazing accurately representation of historic solar activity changes results. The chart shown here clearly proves the inverse relationship between high solar cosmic ray flux and low solar activity in sunspot counts, and of both coinciding with known periods of cold climates on Earth. The fact that cosmic ray interaction with the atmosphere converts nitrogen into carbon-14 that can be measured tells us unmistakably that the extremely cold period of the Little Ice Age that is coincident with the Maunder minimum in sunspot numbers was a period of extremely high cosmic ray flux coming from the Sun. Since it is known that increasing cloudiness, which increases with increasing cosmic ray flux, directly increases the amount of incoming solar energy radiated back into space by the white tops of clouds, we have an unmistakable relationship established with the carbon-14 measurements that low solar activity increases solar cosmic ray flux, which becomes reflected in colder climates, and vice versa. The bottom line is that the carbon-14 measurements present undeniable proof that all the huge climate changes that are known have resulted from cosmic changes that affect our Sun, and by nothing else. The measured carbon-14 values line up so perfectly with the known historic cold periods that the end result gives us on-the-ground measured comparative evidence that the long-term climate changes on Earth, both for the cold periods and the warm periods, are the direct result of changing intensity of the operations on the Sun that reflect space weather factors external to the solar system itself. Man-made CO2 is demonstrated thereby not to be a climate factor. It also proves that the carbon gas global warming hoopla employs a scientific fraud to vilify humanity. It needs to be noted here that the solar reflection in carbon-14 production was overshadowed from the 1960s on by the effects of atomic bomb testing, after which the measurements became meaningless. It is reasonable, however, to assume that the established trend at the end of the measured period would continue until other compelling cosmic factors would indicate otherwise, such as the diminishment of the solar wind that NASA's Ulysses spacecraft has reported between 1998 and 2008. Fortunately for us all, there had been enough plasma density remaining in the cosmic system at the time of the Little Ice Age, which may have remained in the background from the medieval warming period, so that the solar system was able to recover from its long doldrums of critically low solar activity. If the recovery hadn't occurred, very few people would be alive on the Earth today. As it was, we were lucky. In the 1700s, the sunspots began to reappear. Cloudiness diminished, the Earth became warmer, the great global warming began. Obviously, as I said before, the recovery of the Sun clearly wasn't caused by increased human activity, industrial processes, and carbon energy production, and so forth. Humanity has not yet achieved the capability to affect the Sun in any way whatsoever. It would be wonderful if we had this capability as human beings on the Earth to invigorate the gigantic system of the Sun, because if we had this capability, it would enable us to avoid the next ice age that will likely begin in the near future in the 2050s, according to a great volume of evidence at hand. Unfortunately, our affecting the Sun remains at the present time an possible dream. This means that we have to face the coming ice age with open eyes and face it as the universe is causing it, and that we react to the timing that the universe dictates. The timing is critical here. The start of the next ice age is likely closer than we would wish it to be. Let's take this realization back to the sunspots. For 28 years in the middle of the Little Ice Age, only 50 sunspots occurred, in comparison with the 50,000 that occur in our time in the same length of period. As I said before, it seems miraculous that the sun recovered at all from this near-dead state, and that even as it did, the recovery sputtered. It didn't get fully underway until after the Dalton minimum had ended in the 1850s. Just as in the long-term context, the carbon-14 data tells us that the solar cosmic ray flux was extremely large at the time of the Maunder minimum, which was the worst time of the Little Ice Age. The carbon-14 data also tells us that the minimal values in solar activity have been steadily diminishing. It seems reasonable to project from the measured projections that the recovery from the next large solar minimum and its Little Ice Age may not happen at all. We see the same down-ramping that we see between the minimal periods, also reflected between the maximum periods. Both of the measured slopes project that a recovery from the next Little Ice Age is extremely unlikely, that instead a phase shift will happen that will take us into the inactive phase of the sun, where the surface plasma fusion stops and the next ice age begins. The high rate of solar cosmic ray flux that we have measured from the Maunder minimum tells us that the solar corona was not just full of holes at this stage, but was extremely thin altogether. In other words, the solar system may have been close to the phase shift to the inactive state even then. We can expect the situation to be much worse for the next Little Ice Age that is invariably coming, with which the next big ice age may begin. When the phase shift happens to an inactive sun and with it to the big ice age, an entirely different platform for the climate on Earth begins. The comfortable interglacial climate platform that we presently enjoy will end, and the glacial platform will resume that we have never experienced in all remembered history, but which we have glacial records of. All of the climate experiences in the entire period of civilization will appear as nothing then, and be overshadowed by the new reality of a cold climate that promises to be 40 times colder than the Little Ice Age had been, according to the ice core data from the previous ice age. That's what we see as the result of the long-term down-ramping. That's what the down-ramping points to as being inevitable. The down-ramping is also already becoming evident in the short term. We see it reflected there as an ongoing down-ramping of the individual sunspot cycles, and as a down-ramping of the solar wind pressure that NASA's Ulysses spacecraft had measured. Ulysses had measured a 30% in solar wind pressure in just 10 years. That's huge. It tells us that on the linear scale, the solar winds will diminish to zero in the 2030s, and that the sun itself will diminish after that. It is not unreasonable to recognize from this long diminishing of the electrodynamic process that the solar system will electrically collapse at some point on the diminishing slope, with the sun going inactive, possibly in the 2050s, that then causes the next ice age to begin. We are extremely close to that. It may even happen sooner. The climate on Earth will likely collapse somewhat less rapidly than the sun itself will collapse, because large stores of thermal energy remains locked up in the oceans. Nevertheless, agriculture will collapse instantly in the diminished sunlight, except in the tropics where the solar exposure is 2 to 3 times greater. The northern regions from Canada to Europe to Russia will most certainly become uninhabitable, perhaps equally rapid as the livable zone will shrink to a narrow band centered on the equator. Whether humanity survives the transition, which may happen 30 years from the present, will depend on society's reaction in the present. If the infrastructures are being built that enable us to relocate the northern countries into the tropics, with thousands of new cities being built in the tropics and with new agriculture and industries being created there, humanity will have a chance to continue to live and prosper. If not, a few million peoples will survive. The rest of humanity will die of the cold and of starvation. Will you and your children be among them? All children living today are so affected, and all adults who expect to live for more than 30 years. The question whether humanity will live or will die will be settled by how humanity responds in the present to the Ice Age challenge, and the efforts that are made individually and universally to assure that the infrastructures for survival will be created. So it is up to you, too, whether you and your children will have a future or die in agony. It is not my place to make this decision for you. This is the stage where we are today. Most likely decision by humanity to rescue itself will not be made, so that all but a few will die. Under the present regime of near-worldwide irregular warfare against humanity, which has disabled humanity's soul, science and culture on a wide scene already, and has demolished the very image of men as human beings, to the point that people become ashamed to be alive as a danger to the planet, both under the depopulation dogma and the carbon climate change doctrine. There is little power remaining in this state of coma in society for society to wake itself up from its imposed coma and turn the ship around. What I am presenting here may seem like a harsh assessment. Unfortunately, the evidence supports this line of scientific projection. Society is in a coma, asleep, dreaming, where nothing much moves anymore. It lives the dreams that it has been educated to dream, such as the nightmares that man-made global warming is real, dangerous, and is ultimately unstoppable, that it can only be delayed, for which enormous sacrifices are demanded that become an economic death sentence. The point is that once one is in a coma, nothing that is ruminated in the dreaming is grounded in anything real. The resulting dream state level of thinking is at best extremely infantile, akin to being ground into dust. The engineered sleep state has crippled science. In the dream, reality has become forsworn. It is of no concern anymore. For example, as soon as the pioneering concept of the plasma galaxy model was proposed, The Big Bang cosmology was hastily invented to bury the rational science concept with concepts where nothing is real. The model of the self-consuming hydrogen sun was similarly injected into the dream landscape where nothing is real, where what is deemed reality is simply fabricated. Another example of science inversion is the mythical galactic model of orbiting stars spinning around an imaginary galactic center. The resulting dream state has been driven to such extremes that the academies of science don't believe in physics anymore. This sad inversion is evidently intentional, as a means to dishonor Johannes Kepler, one of the great pioneers in physical science, and to block the recognition of the Ice Age dynamics that are located in advanced science. Even truth itself is dishonored in the dream where nothing is real. The estimated global temperature increase on the right of the graphics is the scarecrow of man-made climate change that has been paraded for decades to inspire humanity to destroy its energy production and scrap industrial development. With the face of reality being kept hidden in modern irregular warfare, the simple fact is not being recognized that the increasing estimated temperature values plotted by NASA in GISS reflect nothing more than the known increase in solar activity that is reflected in the carbon-14 measurements. Again, it needs to be noted here that the solar reflection in the carbon-14 values was overshadowed by the effects of the atomic bomb testing in the 1960s. That's when the carbon-14 graph stops. It is reasonable, however, to assume that the established trend has continued, probably until 1997, which the temperature charts indicate. On-the-ground temperature measurements at the Institute of Solar Terrestrial Physics in Irkutsk indicated that a phase shift to colder temperatures had begun in 1998, which is not reflected in the NASA graphs shown here, as the global reflection tends to lag behind the Irkutsk trend by 3 years. The Institute measured a drop in average annual ground temperatures of 1.1 degrees in 1998, and an additional 0.5 degrees drop in 1999, and still another 0.3 degrees drop in 2000. The on-the-ground measured cooling in Irkutsk coincides in time with the 30% reduction in the solar wind pressure that NASA's spacecraft Ulysses had measured in the space around the Sun on the third orbit beginning in 1998. Both of these measurements, in conjunction with the carbon-14 measurements, place the cause for the climate change directly into the courts of the Sun, and exonerates humanity from the charge of being the climate villain that the scare scenarios make it out to be. Of course, as one would expect in times of war, reality is never allowed to enter the theaters of politics, as it would shut down the war. The real climate measurements are simply ignored in this theater and replaced with fantasies. Not a word about anything real is allowed to be spoken in the theaters of politics, which has become subsumed to the objectives in modern irregular warfare. For the same reason, will the volumes of evidence for the coming Ice Age transition in the 2050s remain hidden, including the underlying science of it. In order to survive, society will have to dig itself out from its comatose state and rediscover what is real. This needs to include the rediscovering of what a human being is. Our prayers and highest hopes should therefore be that we may open our eyes to behold what is actually real. Then, when we get to this point and stop dreaming, and only then, will we acknowledge that while the Earth's climate has forever been changing and will continue to change by the dynamics of its nature that is rooted in cosmic dynamics, the human presence and human activity, which has not affected the Earth's climate in any way and never will be correctly understood. Then man becomes exonerated on all counts from the charge of being a climate villain or a burden on the Earth. The fact that much of humanity has been drawn into a state of coma, scientifically, where nothing is real, does not mean that all false science is intentionally false. Some science errors are the result of honest scientific mistakes, as for example the Milankovitch cycles theory for the Ice Age cycles. It has been long believed in earlier times, and still is believed by some, that ice ages result from the combination of three types of minute long-term variations in the Earth's orbit around the Sun, with overlapping cycle times of 26,000, 41,000, and 100,000 years in duration. While these cycles cause minute variations in the hemispheric and seasonal distribution of the solar radiation on Earth, the variations do not alter the total energy received from the Sun, whereby the global ice age can never really occur on this basis. In this case, a bit of common sense and also Johannes Kepler's laws of planetary motion invalidate the Milankovitch cycles theory, which is revealed thereby as simply a mistake. Other science mistakes, however, are evidently intentional, as they defy known scientific facts. They typically defy clearly understood facts in order to drive the carbon climate fraud home, no matter what it takes. One of the main elements of the carbon fraud is that changes in CO2 cause climate changes. In this, ice core data is often cited as proof in support of the fraud. It has been discovered that ice age climates correspond with low CO2 levels, and the warm interglacial climates with high CO2 levels, and that the global warming that has occurred from the end of the Little Ice Age until 1998 has resulted from man-made additions to the global CO2. This intentional science distortion of reality is plainly a form of science fraud, because it is an understood fact that cold climates reduce the global CO2 density, because in colder climates greater volumes of CO2 are absorbed in the cold waters in the oceans, while smaller volumes are evaporated in the tropical warm waters. The result simply means that changing temperatures drive the CO2 density changes. The lag time between the two is known to be in the range of hundreds of years, ranging from 300 years to roughly 800 years. With this known, it becomes scientific fraud to proclaim that CO2 changes are driving the temperature changes, while the opposite is the case. The cause for the long lag time for the CO2 response to temperature changes is understood. The physical dynamics that render the CO2 changes responsive with a time delay rather than being causative is quite simple. The fact that the CO2 in the air becomes primarily dissolved in the cold polar regions and cold polar oceans are having the highest surface density of water in the world. The cold CO2-rich waters that are also dense polar waters sink by their greater weight in the polar regions. They sink into deep pools, from where they circulate across the planet in a system of interlocked ocean currents that carry their dissolved CO2 with them. The cold polar oceans are CO2-rich because cold seawater can contain slightly over 3,000 parts per million of CO2, close to 10 times the atmospheric density, which seems to explain why the polar oceans are extremely nutrient-rich. CO2 is, after all, critical for life, even for plankton in the oceans. The Arctic dense waters have an outflow from their pools that flow all the way to Antarctica, where it joins up with Antarctica's own deep pool that encircles the continent. The Antarctic deep current flows around the continent in the direction of the spin of the Earth and slightly faster. As it does, two branches of dense water spin off from it into two major streams. One of the branching deep streams, shown here in blue, flows along the east coast of Africa, where the cold, dense waters warm up, rise to the surface, and in the process relinquish their high concentration of dissolved CO2, which become a part of the air again. The second deep branch flows into the Pacific, where its CO2 is likewise relinquished. Because of the slow movement of the currents, it takes hundreds of years for the dissolved CO2 to flow from the Arctic back to the tropics to become an atmospheric gas again. For the deep currents along the coast of Africa, the CO2 transit time appears to be in the range of 350 years, and for the Pacific stream, it may be in the range of 500 years. The transit time from the Arctic region in the north to Antarctica is believed to be in the range of 1,000 years. The long-delayed CO2 response to temperature changes is evidently resulting from the long transit times. The atmospheric CO2 is not a static pool, it is constantly recycled. A large portion is recycled through the ocean at a rate of roughly 12% of the entire atmospheric CO2 volume per year. It is known that the oceans hold 50 times as much CO2 than the atmosphere does. This means that 12% of the man-made contribution to atmospheric CO2 becomes absorbed into the ocean's recycling system every year, or essentially all of it within 9 years. The absorbed CO2 effectively disappears from the landscape for 350 to 500 years. It won't re-emerge until the end of its transit loop. For the CO2 from the Arctic waters, the transit time may be as long as 1,000 years or more. This means that if every human activity that emits CO2 into the atmosphere was totally shut down, the increase of the atmospheric CO2 would continue, because a portion of today's atmospheric CO2 originated in the Little Ice Age and has been in transit through the recycling system for 350 years. It is known that extremely large volumes of CO2 had been dissolved into the oceans during the colder times of the Little Ice Age, So much so that a major dip shows up in the ice core measurements of atmospheric CO2 of this time. The CO2 increase that we see reflects this recycle time of the global conveyor belt system. The high rate of CO2 absorption in the Little Ice Age is brought back to us in the present. The Maunder minimum is well within the range for the recycle transit time to the coast of Africa. In the same manner is the CO2 from the more distant cold period of the Spiro minimum within range today via the outflow in the mid-Pacific. It would be surprising if the huge volumes of CO2 that had been absorbed in the conveyor system during the big cold periods would not reappear at the end of the transit cycle. This is precisely what we see happening, and what one would expect to see for an extremely slow recycling system. We see the absorption dips from the last 3 big cold periods for the ice core records in Antarctica shown here. Why shouldn't the absorbed huge volume of CO2 be returned to the atmosphere by the dynamics of this recycling system? The answer is that what we are seeing in terms of CO2 increase in modern time is clearly not man-made. This means that the results that we now see unfolding is likely just the beginning of a much larger trend to come that would continue even if humanity ceased to exist. This also means that the entire CO2 hockey stick scare campaign that vilifies humanity is completely groundless, which adds another reason that renders the basis for the carbon global warming terror project groundless likewise. Sure, humanity is presently injecting roughly 8 to 10 billion tons of carbon gas into the atmosphere, which is in the range of roughly 1% of the total atmospheric CO2. The volume is insignificant, however, as it gets largely lost in the long extended recycling process, rather than it hanging around accumulating. Considering that the man-made CO2 scarecrow card, which is typical with its typical hockey stick rise in modern time, is being blown up big for the vilification for humanity, while the major operating dynamics are all known that present opposite evidence, demonstrates that the CO2 scarecrow card is basically a fraud by intention that is deployed as a weapon in the game of modern irregular warfare against humanity. The fraud vilifies humanity. It produces infantile responses in society, akin to a state of dreaming in which society can be easily controlled towards its self-destruction. This is the clearly demonstrated intention, which matches the intention of modern irregular warfare. The CO2 fraud is then, evidently, just another card in the deck of terror of the modern irregular warfare process, where the physical reality is never an issue, but is typically hidden. The 2015 terrorist acts in Paris, just weeks before the UN climate conference in this city, were likely perpetrated to assure that increased police state measures would be implemented to prevent protest demonstrations and protest marches from occurring that might raise some points of truce against the climate scarecrow and wake a few of the comatose delegates assembled at the €120 million extravaganza event that is designed to destroy humanity ever more deeply, with ever more strangling impositions than humanity already is. The modern irregular war against humanity has many such faces and many cards in the deck, including the core of naked terror, while the war itself is singular, controlled and financed for a purpose, and the masters at the top are one. There is no such thing as spontaneous terror in the age of modern irregular warfare. If it was, it would be extremely rare. Terror is so radically foreign to human living and human identity that it can exist only in organized form, cultivated, trained, financed, armed, and directed for a purpose. It exists as a card of a deck of many cards, which are all played in the way that strategists require. Ultimately, it will be irrelevant what happens in Paris, since the goal in modern irregular warfare is not centered on individual victories. The goal in irregular warfare is always the long-term objective. It is to grind the opponent to empire, which is humanity, into the dust. The biofuels scam is just a card in the deck. In the name of reducing CO2 emissions from automobiles, high-value food products such as corn and soybeans are converted into alcohol fuels to be burned. The project is a gigantic cultural warfare act from its inception. In the case of ethanol, the burning of it produces 7% less CO2 than octane, while the additional CO2 from the energy input for producing the ethanol fuel nearly doubles the total. Evidently, the stated goal isn't the goal at all, but is a ruse that covers for the real goal, which is the destruction of humanity with the tool of mass murder. Lord Russell bluntly stated that wars are insufficient in that they don't murder enough people. He called for more efficient methods. The biofuels card plays in this direction. Biofuels are not efficient new net energy resources for the simple reason that the production of them requires nearly as much energy in total energy inputs than the fuel gives back. The biofuels card is only efficient in causing mass genocide in a hungry world with the mass burning of food. The agricultural resources that are diverted from food production to biofuels production would at the present stage nourish upwards to 400 million people. In a world that has 500 million people living in chronic starvation, the mass burning of food on such a scale leaves a trail of 100 million corpses in the wake every year by death from starvation. This horrendous death toll probably exceeds all the war deaths from all the wars in history combined, repeated every single year. Maybe this is what Lord Russell meant when he said that wars don't kill enough. Large segments of the world are now committed to participate in the mass murder holocaust by their own volition. They are dreaming with their eyes closed that this gigantic holocaust of murder, the largest in all history, will save the planet from overheating. Very few people who are participating in this enormously wide genocide process realize that they themselves are the targeted victims when they pull up to the gas pump and fill up with E10, E15 or E85 or whatever the case may be, while the 100 million people who are dying of starvation quietly in far-off lands each year are merely a collateral expense for the creeping destruction of society as a whole that is intended by grinding it into the dust slowly and gradually from within as human beings, as an opponent to empire. But is this remedy really the method that had been pioneered by the Roman politician and general Quintus Fabius Maximus in defense of Rome against the vastly superior invading forces of Hannibal? The principle of Fabius was to simply disable the invading force, not to destroy it. Russia saved itself against Napoleon in 1812 by this principle. In modern irregular warfare, this principle is turned upside down. Humanity is being attacked by it instead of being defended by it. The resulting difference is as absolute as night and day. The ruling empire of today aims to destroy humanity to its very core and boil it down to less than 1 billion people to be kept like zoo animals, imprisoned and controlled. The problem is, for the empire system, that the inversion of a profound principle is recursive. Rome destroyed itself on this platform. It looted all the people round about till there was nothing left to loot, whereby Rome fell onto its own sword. The sword is recursive. The current world empire that operates without a name, or has many names, is already dying by its recursive sword. The financial system that has looted the world is functionally already dead. The naked terror card is played ever more furious now because of that, which by it being played hastens the master's own demise. No force in the world can prevent the fall of their system. However, humanity does not need to fall with them. The Fabius principle of the strategic defense can be successfully applied by humanity in its defense against empire. The principle virtually guarantees its success. The move towards is already on in the United States to apply the Fabius strategic defense principle to save the nation. The strategic defense principle had previously been applied in the form of the Glass-Steagall bank system protection legislation in 1933 by President Franklin Roosevelt. In recent years, a movement has begun in the USA to restore the Glass-Steagall legislation for the strategic defense of the nation. In doing this, America writes itself a ticket for its survival. A similar strategic defense is possible to be achieved by society against the carbon global warming scarecrow card, the biofuels scarecrow card, and the depopulation scarecrow card. This can be done by simply looking at the reality, which is that there is nothing standing behind these scare cards, which isn't pure fabrication on every point, as this video has demonstrated. On this path, humanity as a whole writes itself a ticket to have a future once again, which currently is not even a concept anymore. The principle of the strategic defense that Quintus Fabius Maximus has pioneered might ultimately be the only workable platform in humanity's defense against nuclear war. Nuclear war is designed from the ground up to function as a scarecrow card in the deck of modern irregular warfare. The scarecrow cards are each one designed in its individual way to keep sanity away from the fields of the theaters of empire and to render humanity stupid and asleep. The principle of the strategic defense must therefore cover the entire deck of the irregular warfare cards, which is possible by the nature of principle which is singular. On this platform, humanity writes itself a ticket to universal liberty and a new renaissance with such power that it can meet the Ice Age challenge on the platform of the strategic defense of humanity that then becomes possible. All this is possible, but will it be done? The process of humanity writing itself a ticket to meet the coming near ice age with a song requires an immediate commitment, followed by the building of vast industries, for the building of the vast infrastructures that are needed, followed by the building of the infrastructures themselves. That's the only ticket that can be written for humanity, for a bright future in an ice age world. Today, for as far as I can see, the fields for developing this commitment are rather empty of people reaching for it. The scarecrow cards still rule the landscape. It was different in the early days. There was still some life left on the scene of humanity and its science. Large efforts were made in the early days of the scarecrow cards to keep the world mentally alive by focusing on the known truth versus the known fraud. The movement started with the Heidelberg Appeal in 1992 that went out to the world from the University of Heidelberg in Germany, followed by the Leipzig Declaration, the Oregon Petition Project, and the huge 2007 U.S. Senate report, all urging the world to wake up to an unfolding fraud against science and humanity. These were all movements towards the strategic defense principle. The Heidelberg Appeal was supported by 4,000 scientists from 69 countries, including nearly as many Nobel laureates. Of course, their voices were not allowed to be heard at the Rio Earth Summit of the Modern Irregular Warfare Project. Undeterred by the failure, the Leipzig Declaration was launched from the University of Leipzig. The project addressed only the narrow field of climatologists and climate specialists. The project collected 110 signatures from this highly specialized group. It was submitted to the Kyoto Climate Conference, and again it was not allowed to be heard. The response to the Kyoto tragedy that resulted from the lack of truth in its premise and had resulted in a global accord, which the Russian Academy of Science termed a global suicide pact, the really big Oregon Petition Project was launched. The Petition Project addressed all scientists worldwide in a campaign to urge the nations to reject the Kyoto Accord. This time, 17,000 people with academic backgrounds responded. It may have been on the basis of this huge response that only a few countries actually ratified the Economic Suicide Accord. In 2007, the U.S. Senate report staged another scene of science opposition against the scare cards. The Senate didn't collect just signatures of agreement or disagreement, but required written statements with details for the individuals' reasons for their stand against the scarecrow cards. The Senate collected 400 of these reports from individual respondents. The reports are all on file. It is often said to the present day that the carbon climate change theory is universally understood and is backed by wide consensus among the scientists. The statement is true only in the sense that it is widely understood in honest science that man-made carbon climate change is physically impossible. There appears to be a consensus in the community of real science that the promoted carbon scare theory is crap. Over 30,000 people with academic standing have made the effort to respond to a mail-in project as the latest effort. This appears to be a real consensus of standing and opposition found in the science community. Of course, the media also created its own type of consensus that it is hired for, as it is required for the modern irregular warfare objective. The media created a consensus in guided dreaming where nothing is fundamentally understood, where the theories are simply accepted and people bow to the degenerating effect they have. The result is that of a hidden type of terrorism. The Ice Age challenge, in contrast, has the opposite effect. It challenges society to truly awake, to ramp up its civilization. It inspires the self-up-ramping of humanity to ever greater forms of economic development and scientific and technological progress. This uplifting imperative is far from being a terrorist objective that puts society mentally into a coma and demands depopulation. In real terms, the world needs more people, not less. The building of a new world in response to the Ice Age challenge that is now before us, 30 years into the future, requires the combined effort of the entire world. It requires a full commitment to truth in science, with a full commitment to the development of the power of the human mind and the human potential. This commitment on which civilization rests amounts to nothing less than the full commitment in society to the principle of the general welfare in all regards as a high-level form of strategic defense. This includes free quality universal housing, health care, education, with the remaining needs being met as freely as possible. The general welfare principle as a strategic defense against the poverty of small-minded thinking is the minimal starting platform to spearhead the fullest development possible of the greatest asset that a society has, which is itself. If anyone thinks that the Ice Age challenge can be met on any lesser platform, this person is dreaming, and dreaming won't do. The great German poet of freedom, Friedrich Schiller, had asked in his ascetical letters referring to the failed French Revolution, "Why is it that a great moment found such a little people?" He suggested that while the moment for great change in the flow of history had been at hand at the time, the moral condition in society to grasp the potential of the moment and to move with it had been lacking. As many people had later realized with tears in the aftermath of the failure of the revolution, that the conditioning that they had lacked at a critical moment became their lacking conditioning to survive on the personal level. The great moment in our time is the Ice Age decision moment, and it will always be that until the Ice Age challenge is met. The 2015 UN Climate Conference in Paris has the potential to serve as a stage for a moment of truth, for a moment of profound realization that stops the carbon dreaming, a moment to lay down the climate scarecrows, a moment for humanity to stand as giants in the defense of its future and thereby of itself, by getting serious in considering the Ice Age challenge. Humanity had once taken such a stand as giants and had accomplished what had never been accomplished before or had been since. It stood as giants, literally, standing side by side. It ended nearly 100 years of war in 1648, not with a sword, but with a pen in hand and an open and alert mind. It created a peace that had rendered all humanity sovereign in principle and honored with the commitment to promote what is of the advantage to the other, which is to everyone's advantage. The meeting of giants in 1648 had been convened against the background of Johannes Kepler's staging of a great moment for truth in the science of astrophysics that had liberated astronomy from centuries of dreaming. The pioneers in 1648 had latched on to this moment. It might have been their conditioning to become giants and stand tall, to stand as human beings. The principle of universal sovereignty, which had been put onto the map in a big way in 1648, and was reflected in advancing science and technology thereafter, still stands today as the guiding star in civilization, though this star is fast being eroded and is almost universally denied in the fields of modern irregular warfare. The Tower of Paris that you see before you has been visited by more than 250 million people. It stands today as a lone reminder of a once proud past. The Paris UN Climate Conference lacks the historic link to the critical moments of truth, as did all the preceding climate conferences of the last 40 years. Where will we find the Johannes Keplers of today, like he who raised the standard of truth in astrophysics and set the stage for the giants to emerge on it? It appears that this time the call to arise from the comatose dreaming will have to be pioneered by society itself. Society must make the call, which a human being should most certainly be able to make. No one can release society of this responsibility to itself. Perhaps when this is understood, and perhaps only when society does make this call to awake itself, will the new song be sung that marks the end of the dream time. It will be a simple but profound song. O dreamer, leave behind your dream in joyful waking. O captive, arise and wield your power to be free. Then stand on the hilltops, the golden truth proclaiming, and paint the sky with the colors of universal liberty.